Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for choosing our luncheon to attend today. During December, I know you have choices. Should I be closer or farther away from the mic? Am I perfect? I was just fishing for that. Thank you. Woohoo! Woo! Bring it on. Thank you. Make me feel good. I hope you feel as good. I hope you feel welcome and happy to be here. I was just reading Melinda Gates' book, and she's talking about uplifting women. Her foundation does this incredible work worldwide, and through their research, they found that any community where women are appreciated and elevated out of poverty and women are educated, those communities do better. Those communities survive, those communities are uplifted by uplifting women. And that's what we're about. The Institute for Women in Politics is not just politics. We're about volunteerism and being advocates in your community and ultimately holding leadership roles and getting elected. Having half the seats at the table, working with men like Jeanette Rankin said, who is the first woman elected to Congress in the United States before she had the right to vote, by the way, in like 1918, I think. 1916, thank you. We have educated women here. But she said, if men are one hand and women are the other, why wouldn't we use both hands to get the job done? Of course, it's better when we all work together. So I'm so glad to see you here, and I want to just take a minute to recognize some folks that are here. And I mean, I could name every single person here because you all do so much work in the community. But I'm going to try and just highlight a few people. First of all, let me recognize that we have elected officials here. Mr. Mayor Grover is here. Grover Robinson, woo! And I'm really happy about that because he has 1 million requests, and he is a member of IWP. And we do have 10% of our members are men. So thank you for coming. And you don't even have to speak today. That's even better. Right? Is Mayor Fitch here? Oh, no, okay. I thought I didn't see her. Cherry Fitch and Ann Hill. Councilman Ann Hill is here. Thank you so much for coming. And Pam Childers is here. Thanks for coming. You all do great work, and as a matter of fact, Pam Childers is running again this year. And by the way, the table on the right, on my right, has literature for some of the candidates that are here. We also have some men here that are running. Ron Helms, running for City Council. Phil Ayer is a member who's running. Okay, women running. Michelle Salzman, over here. Yeah. Diane Crummell. Woo. Am I forgetting anybody? Phil Ayer. Elizabeth Huey is running for school board. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you for yelling out for me. As far as candidates. And you know what? I don't know you, so feel free to stand up and tell me your name. You jumped the gun? Okay, we're not announcing whoever that is running today. Thank you, though. I look forward to it. Let's meet later. I'd also like to take a moment to recognize the sponsors of our tables this year. Diane Crummell's posse bought her a table. Crummell for state rep over there. Walker Strategies, where's Anna? Anna is on the board and has created in the last year a thriving lobbying firm. Thanks, Anna, for being here and buying a table again. Wind Creek Hospitality has always been a really solid supporter of ours. We're happy to have them back. James Reeves, our newest male member. Woohoo! And back in the corner, because they're the rowdiest bunch, the Greater Pensacola Chamber of Commerce. Hey, I like to see you be more rowdy when I say you're the rowdiest bunch. Somebody jump up and down. Thank you, Willa. Okay. Thank you all for supporting us. We love that you're here. I want to mention the table that I'm sitting at today. The future of IWP for the next year is really going to focus on the centennial. It is 100 years since women earned the right to vote. Oh my gosh, it made me cry. I'm in the right job because that made me cry. What's with that? But we're going to do a lot of work about it. We're going to really celebrate that. And that's why Grover's at our table, because we've already talked with him about getting together and planning some citywide celebrations. And that's why Dr. Judy Benz is here today with us. Judy was recently inducted to the Florida State Hall of Fame by the Florida Commission on the Status of Women. Only one from the Panhandle. Woohoo! Nice. She's also been appointed to the statewide commission on this centennial commemoration. So we look forward to collaborating with whatever the statewide group is going to do. We're going to make it happen here. Which also I'd like to mention Laura Gilliam and Donna Edwards. Laura's the director of United Way, and Donna is on the board and part of Women United. And we are going to partner this year to knock out events for celebration. Speaking of those events, look on your table. There's a little kind of purple and gray card. On the back of that is a list of events, and you can take those home. They actually aren't etched in stone because a couple things have changed already, but what is absolute is the grade lines of voter registration and election days. So keep those in mind. Make sure that you're registered and make sure that you vote. As far as the events, that's our first pass at a tentative list of what we're going to do with partnerships in the community. Did I see Paula Montgomery here? There she is, Paula with League of Women Voters, Michelle Caldwell. There's a lot of groups in this city that are women's groups that want to participate in a collaboration for a really huge effort, not just a small thing to commemorate the centennial. So we look forward to working with all of you. And I'm going to give everybody my cell phone number, and we're going to have a lot of fun for the next year. Last thing I'd like to mention really quickly is, well, actually two things. There's an event in January that's going to be really kind of our first event for the centennial, and it's going to be at the National Flight Academy. Hannah Ritz is here. She's the manager of administration for the National Flight Academy. She's also on our board. So she is going to give a tour of NFA and provide a little party afterwards and have a showing of the movie Iron Jawed Angels for the centennial. So look on your calendar. That is correct, on January 20th. The second thing I want to mention right now is that when those cards went to print, Sarah Lefevers and I were planning this fantastic collaboration of a candidate school for February, but the chamber's just too darn busy to do that in February. So we're going to do it April 17th. And it's going to be epic, and I think it's going to be not just 101 information, but also 201. So you all candidates that are already running, I think you might want to come to this, because we're talking about analytics and debate techniques and kind of second-level campaigning. So we hope to see you all there, because we want you all to win, right? Okay, without further ado, I'm going to ask Deb to come up. Deb Corbin is the vice president of IWP, and I'd like her to be recognized because she did this event today. And it's awesome. And she's also going to introduce our speaker. So thank you all for coming, and I'll talk to you again after the speaker. Thanks.
Yeah. So again, welcome. Is that okay? I'm so excited to see a full house because, as many of you know, there were so many things to do today at the same time. So we really value that you're here. I'm really excited about our speaker, but before I introduce our speaker, what I did want to say, in addition to the wonderful announcements that Myra shared with you, on the table we also have petitions. And so before you leave today, please feel free to go over and sign petitions so we can get people on the ballot. So let's see some nods for yeah? Great, thanks. What I will tell you is that we didn't do any name tags and who was the speaker and who said it. But my faux pas today is I had a fabulous introduction. We got here early, we got everything set up, and somewhere along the line, my introduction is out there. So I'm doing this from memory. Nancy Abadou is from currently Atlanta, and she's with the Southern Poverty Law Center. In her past, she started as an intern, and she helped defend women who were abuse victims. So I think that, first I thought she was an angel there, so from there it only went up. She went to law school at Tulane, so she's familiar with NOLA and all the fabulous restaurants and things you can do to get in trouble and enjoy culture over there. She has 2 daughters that are 15 and 12, and we're going to get one of them, I hope, to see Hannah out at the Flight Academy. So without further ado, and I'm sorry I couldn't say all your other accolades, I'll let her do the talking.
All right. Well, thank you, Deb, and huge thanks to IWP for inviting me to be here today. And of course, much appreciation to all of you for spending your afternoon talking about what is, of course, an important issue, voting rights in general, and then voting rights for women. And when I was doing my research in preparation for this talk, I, of course, went to the website and educated myself to know that you all are politically a very diverse crowd. I'm used to generally talking to kind of the more progressive leftist wing, where a lot of the issues that the Southern Poverty Law Center focuses on involves just preaching to the choir. But it was nice to know that there is an organization like the Institute that brings together people across various political lines and issue areas to recognize that the commonality of making sure that women in particular not only exercise our right to vote, but realize what that vote means in terms of not only political representation, but also changing some of the policies that impact our lives and have made it difficult for women to participate politically in the first place. And so I am feeling a lot of the positive energy and love in this room. You would never know who's on which side of the aisle. And I think the day drinking part of it is kind of cool too, which saved me a glass for after this presentation. So for those of you who might not be familiar with the Southern Poverty Law Center, we're an organization that started in 1971, based in Montgomery, Alabama, but I am in our second biggest office in Atlanta. We are a nonpartisan organization. Our focus is not to elect any candidate from a particular party, but to elect candidates who advance our issue and mission areas. And that really is described as just trying to improve the life condition of the most vulnerable and marginalized members of our society. So at the bare minimum, that's really what our focus is. And anyone who is supportive of that mission is a friend of the Southern Poverty Law Center. However, the Voting Rights Practice Group, which I represent as the Deputy Legal Director, is brand new. We started in February of 2019, so not too long ago in terms of starting this year. And the reason really was recognizing that in particular when it comes to the Deep South, there is an absence of enough groups and resources to make sure that, again, people are able to exercise their fundamental right to vote. And I emphasize the word fundamental because the US Supreme Court has recognized it, literally calling it a fundamental right, preservative of all other rights that we enjoy as members of the American society, and in particular as US citizens. And also because that is the right that is really being under siege in our estimation when we look at the landscape across, not only in the Deep South, but across the country. But for sure in the Deep South, when we think about issues in terms of election administration and the fact that you still have places, unlike Florida, that do not have early voting. And as a result of not having early voting, for example, during the November 2018 election, you had some places where, for example, over 200,000 people were not able to vote because they didn't have the time on election day to stand in the long lines and cast that ballot. We're talking about issues when it comes to election protection and folks showing up at the polls and being told that they're not on the voter list, they're at the wrong polling place, and the poll worker not letting them know that in many instances you can still change your address at that polling place, you can update it, and then vote a regular ballot. We're talking about issues or situations in which people are being forced to cast provisional ballots, even though we know statistically they are less likely to be counted than a regular ballot. And we're also talking about issues in terms of polling place locations. And a lot of individuals might not appreciate how significant the location of a polling place is. But if you don't have transportation, or you have historically voted in a place and you only have a limited amount of time to get your vote cast, then where your polling place is and the movement of that polling place without your prior notice can create a serious obstacle and result in you not being able to vote. Another issue is the census. You know, in addition to a major election that we're having next year, we've also got the census count. The importance of making sure that every person is counted, which is really the sole purpose of the census, because it's not about who you are or where you're from or how much money you make. It's literally, are you physically present in the United States? Are you physically present in a particular locality? And therefore, what does that mean for that locality in terms of federal funding for the infrastructure that's necessary to expand and improve the conditions of those places? And then, of course, redistricting. After we finish up with the November 2020 election, we'll be using the information from the census count to then redraw our political lines. And the importance of making sure, again, that not a particular party is elected, but that the candidate of choice for the voters from that district is elected. Because again, it's about making sure that whoever our candidates are, and this of course is a message for those of you who are running or running again, that at the end of the day, it is the voters, it's a job. And that the voters have put you in that job. They've essentially hired you to fulfill a mission. And that as voters, it is our ultimate responsibility to make sure that the job is getting done, and that it's getting done in a professional, ethical way that upholds the principles of our country, that upholds the principles of the individuals who have voted for you, and that your votes on the House or the Senate floor or in Congress really represent the values of the community that put you in office in the first place. And so these are the issues that the Southern Poverty Law Center, along with many of our partners, are taking on, and why I'm so excited to be heading up this particular program. Now, again, in reading the website and knowing that you have a diversity of political views, it was actually perfect timing for me to draw from a quote of a Georgia senator, Johnny Isakson, who's actually retiring at the end of this year due to health problems. But something that he said on the floor of the Senate earlier this week really resonated with me, because not every place that we go in this country is as open as this environment right here, this luncheon today with all of you. As you know, we're dealing with some serious political partisan divisions that are polarizing our country in a way that we probably haven't really seen in decades. And so for someone like Senator Isakson, who is a Republican, who has been a public servant for over 40 years, who has reached across the aisle when it was necessary, but who has also stuck with his Republican colleagues when he felt that that was the right thing to do. This is what he said to the country that I want to share with you. The best country in the world, the strongest country in the world, cannot succumb to crushing itself inwardly because we look the other way from the challenges of life. And the challenges of life are that America is changing. Whether you're Black or white, Republican or Democrat, whatever it might be, find a way to find common ground. Give it a chance to work. And if it doesn't work, be a future friend. And he uses the term future friend often, and I thought, okay, well, if you're not, what's the opposite of a future friend? And for me, I think that means a forever foe, and that we don't want to encourage ourselves, our children, other generations to adopt that mindset that even though you can't agree at a particular juncture during a political process, that means that you'll never be able to find common ground in the future. And that we have to be the leaders in terms of advocating and pushing for that mentality, but we have to be the models. Our actions, of course, speak much louder than words. And when I tried to come up with examples, which wasn't very hard, of what a future friend looks like, I, of course, had to reflect on the legislative history and grassroots activism in the passage and ultimate ratification of the 19th Amendment. In 1848, when women held their first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York, it was an opportunity for women, with some male support, of course, to come together from across their own political ideologies. And when we talk about across political ideologies, you're talking even about women who were abolitionists and women who believed in slavery, who believed in the institution of slavery. But at the end of the day, recognized that nothing was going to change in our society if women did not have a political voice in the process. And so they came together and struggled very hard to overcome some of those differences. And for some of the women, those differences weren't overcome, and they found another avenue in terms of pursuing their agenda. But for the most part, the passage of the 19th Amendment is a representation of women coming across various political ideologies together to fight and to achieve one common goal, which was to make sure that women secured the right to vote. The only verb I would change in terms of Myra's introduction is that we had already earned the right. As US citizens, that right should have already been bestowed upon women, well before even the passage of the 14th Amendment. And yet it took decades later, after the 13th and the 14th and the 15th Amendments, for women to finally be recognized on our own as capable, not only intellectually, but emotionally, in terms of our education background, to be able to cast a ballot, that we were no longer going to be subjugated as second-class citizens and being required to rely on men to represent our interests. And not that all men or some men didn't support or recognize our interests, but that at the end of the day, there is no better spokesperson than an impacted person. And so following that convention, you had women really trying to push the envelope, and even someone, a major leader like Elizabeth Stanton, who said, sometimes you have to break the law in order to improve the law. And she did that in 1872, way before the passage of the 19th Amendment, when she actually cast a ballot and then was attempted to be prosecuted and fined for illegally voting. And not her particular situation, but an analogous situation in Missouri made its way all the way to the US Supreme Court in a case known as Minor v. Happersett. And this was a case in which a woman had cast a ballot in a state that denied women the right to vote. And the argument that was made on behalf of the woman was that the 14th Amendment specifically says that all citizens enjoy the privileges and immunities of U.S. citizenship, and that the United States Constitution recognizes the right to vote. Therefore, if there is a right to vote for citizens and women are citizens, we, in 1872, this argument is being raised, we should be able to vote. And the Supreme Court, unfortunately, rejected that argument and found that there was no legislative constitutional support for the argument that even though women were citizens, that women enjoy the right to vote. And in fact, that citizenship in and of itself was not a guarantee of the right to vote. The court not only looked at the history of the Constitution and the legislative history behind the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, but also looked specifically at language within the 14th Amendment, Section 2, actually, of the 14th Amendment, which refers to male inhabitants. And so the court said that if Congress intended for women to really be able to vote, then they wouldn't have used male. They would have said inhabitants. They would have made it more inclusive. So that is evidence against you, women, in terms of being able to vote. If the country were really ready for women to vote, then you wouldn't have all of the states, for the most part, denying women the right to vote. Therefore, again, there's no legal support for the argument. And in the decision, the court says, now this might be wrong policy, but it's not our role as justices to change that policy. It's for the political process to take care of that problem. And so what Ms. Stanton and Ms. Rankin and other women did is they said, okay, we're gonna adopt a grassroots advocacy campaign. We're gonna go door by door, state by state, and we're gonna pressure them to do the right thing, which is to recognize the right of women to vote. And then we're gonna take those votes back to Congress and push for passage of the 19th Amendment. And that's exactly what happened. It took a lot longer than my little summary right now, of course, but that's an example of patience, clarity of focus, clear strategy, and again, getting the job done. And that's how we ended up with the 19th Amendment, which guarantees the right to vote, that says that it cannot be denied or abridged solely based on someone's sex or gender. And again, even before we had the passage of the right to vote, as Myra mentioned, you had Jeanette Rankin, who in 1916 was elected as the first woman to serve in Congress. And one of the quotes that I found from her was that she was excited and proud to be the first woman to vote for the right of women to vote as a member of Congress. And in terms of looking at her history and knowing that being a Republican woman from Montana who was able to rise to her own political ranks with the support of her sisters, of course, but also with the support of men, in particular her brother, who later on in their lives actually diverged politically, but he still was there for her when it came time to run for office, to raise the money and the support that she needed. And so that is just a reminder as women that even though we do have, as impacted people, we have to lead this fight, we need men along the way. So I'm so excited to hear that 10% of your membership is men, and I'm sure that will be growing. And I'm excited and happy to see the men who are here, phenomenal individuals who recognize and respect the power of women and who are not intimidated by the power of women and who are supporting women. And we need to pass that on to our young boys as well so that they grow up and create a new generation of young men who never have the mentality that women are second or third class citizens. So since the passage of the 19th Amendment, we've had some wonderful things happen, of course. Number one, we've got organizations like IWP and the League of Women Voters and even the Girl Scouts which are working hard to make sure that women and girls have the tools that they need to be successful in life and to continue advocating for the issues that concern us. We've had 20 women run for president of the United States, 6 of them just through this 2020, gearing up for this 2020 election cycle. I think that's a good thing. And we've got almost 25% of women, or the House of Representatives in Congress, about 23% women. The Senate, 25% women. I think in the Senate right now, 2019 numbers broke records in terms of the presence of women in the US Senate. And so we know for sure that there have been some very positive outcomes from the passage of the 19th Amendment. Not just the election of women, though. What do they do, or what have we been doing with that political power? We've been passing laws like the Violence Against Women's Act. That was the law that I did an externship with, representing survivors of domestic violence. We've had, and bringing more awareness to that issue and the different types of violence that women are subject to in the home and outside of the home. We have the Lilly Ledbetter Act, which was an effort to really increase or expand protections for women when it comes to pay inequities. And that was a vote. Yeah. And that was a vote that I would say you did have some along party lines. But in the Senate, every single woman, including the Democratic and Republican women, voted in favor of this bill because, again, they put aside their own partisan politics to recognize that whatever your political party is, if you're doing the same job as a man, you should be paid the same amount of money as a man. And then we've also seen some of the fruits in terms of economic development. Even just a little bit of time before this luncheon, I got a chance to speak with some of you who are spearheading innovative programs when it comes to technology, when it comes to creating homes for female veterans, when it comes to exposing girls to math and science. And so again, just to see that we are really using our political power in a way that advances our own life condition, those things are wonderful. And I wanted to start with that because I do want to highlight the good. But there's some bad too. We've got a lot of work to do, especially on the economic front. Women continue overall to make less money than men. And older women in particular are making about 72 cents on the dollar for every man. We know, and perhaps some of the female candidates in the room know better than I, how difficult it is to raise money in order to run for a campaign. We've had women who've had to drop out of races historically because they just can't compete financially when it comes to financing their campaigns. And so that is an issue that we deal with in terms of how do we make sure that we have more women represented in the political arena if they can't afford to be there. So that is an issue that we need to work on as well. And then something that is of particular concern to me is the increased number of women in the criminal justice system. Even though in terms of raw numbers, men, of course, continue to be the majority of those who make up the people incarcerated or on parole or on probation, the rate at which women are being introduced to the system is actually outpacing that of men. And the statistic is about 400% the rate of women entering the system as compared to about 293% of men. And so what that means is that and those statistics are based on since 1985. So what that means is that even though we're seeing gains politically for women on one side of the fence, we're seeing an erosion of even being able to vote through the criminal justice system on the other side. And this is an issue of particular importance to me because I actually started my career as a voting rights lawyer working on felon disenfranchisement and trying to address the problem of people being denied the right to vote simply because they have a criminal conviction. And I realized that when the amendment was put on the ballot in November of 2018, although we had overwhelming support, it wasn't 100% in terms of the voters who cast their ballot in favor of that amendment. But what we do know is that when you have a system where women are already financially disadvantaged entering the society, entering the workforce, and then entering the criminal justice system, and then they exit the criminal justice system and their economic opportunities are even worse. So bad that, for example, 45% of African American women who exit the criminal justice system are unemployed, cannot find a job to support themselves, to support their children, to find affordable, safe housing, therefore lacking access to affordable health care, and the list goes on. So having a criminal conviction has a lot of collateral consequences. But I would say one of the most significant or tragic is losing the right to vote, because that means that those impacted women will almost never, ever be able to influence the policies that put them in that condition in the first place. And so when I think about what does that mean in terms of the 19th Amendment, we know these disparities impact women, but does that equate to a woman or the denial of the right to vote based on gender? It's a theory that I've thought a lot about and that I decided to take a chance and test out in federal court. So in a lawsuit in which the Southern Poverty Law Center and several other organizations are involved related to Florida's Amendment 4, the Rights Restoration Initiative, the SPLC has brought a 19th Amendment claim relying on the statistics that I just shared with you. And it's a novel claim, one, because after the passage of the 19th Amendment, we really didn't have a lot of litigation to tell us what does the 19th Amendment really mean. What does it mean to deny someone the right to vote based on sex? We've had decades of legal history to help us when it comes to race, and we're not even clearly sure all of the time about what that looks like in practice, but we are way behind when it comes to what that looks like for women. After the passage of the 19th Amendment, there were lawsuits to challenge its validity. For example, in 1922, there was a case called Lesser v. Garnett, in which some individuals challenged the 19th Amendment as unconstitutional because one argument was that, well, most states still, there were several states that didn't ratify the 19th Amendment. So how, if women don't have the right to vote in their home state, how can they have the right to vote universally or in federal elections? And the court, the Supreme Court, relying on the decision that I shared with you earlier, recognized that, well, it was ratified, meaning that at least 3/4 of the states did pass it. And now we have language in the Constitution that we didn't have in 1872 that specifically identifies sex and gender as a protected class when it comes to voting. But fast forward, we didn't have the development of the body of law. Unfortunately, in some instances, after the passage of the 19th Amendment, you had the political ideology differences really surface or bubble up again in terms of the different strategies that women suffragists wanted to adopt in order to get the right to vote in the first place. So, for example, you had the League of Women Voters that spun off and decided that they were going to concentrate on voter registration. What does the 19th Amendment mean if we're not actually getting women registered and out there to vote? And then you had the second splinter group that said, well, that's great that we have the 19th Amendment, but voting is not the end-all be-all. We still don't have economic rights. We still don't have autonomy over our body. We still don't have a lot of other issues that are unique to women. So you had the movement for the Equal Rights Amendment, which is still a movement going on today. And so with those two groups kind of going in their separate directions, you didn't have a body of individuals that said, well, regardless of how we're going to implement or interpret the 19th Amendment, we need some direction from the courts to tell us, what does this really mean? So the lawsuit that the Southern Poverty Law Center has filed that includes the 19th Amendment claim is an attempt to do just that, to really put some teeth behind the language and understand what it means and to make sure that we protect it to the fullest extent possible. Some other methods in terms of making sure that we can have more women elected, and not just women in the idea of a token. That's not the idea. You shouldn't get elected solely because you're a woman. It really is about a candidate of choice, someone, as I said earlier, who's going to advance the mission and the needs of women. And so again, it's wonderful when we have men in those positions to do that, but I'm still a firm believer that the impacted person is the best spokesperson. And so we start, of course, with education. Something that remains elusive to a significant enough number of women, whether it's because they live in areas where they don't have easy physical access to an educational institution, whether it's because the public schools are in such bad condition that private school is the only viable option, except it's not an option because they can't afford to pay private school tuition. And then we still have issues, unfortunately, of violence in schools and girls being bullied or subjected to all kinds of inappropriate sexual behavior. So in some cases, it's not a safe environment for our girls. But education, for sure, in terms of those issues, and I'm sure a lot more, is an area where if we can get that right, we can definitely make sure that we develop the next generation of women to carry on the work that each of us are doing in this room. In terms of legislation, another area or opportunity for us to increase political representation for women. I talked about the Violence Against Women's Act, talked about the Equal Pay Act, but then there are other actual voting rights bills that seem innocuous on their face, but actually have a significant impact on women. One example, again, some might think very simple, photo ID laws. When a number of states decided to enact voter photo ID laws, opponents or proponents of those laws said, what's the big deal? Everybody should have a photo ID. And I would venture to say that each of us in this room have a photo ID. But I found out through my own investigation and ultimate litigation that you have a significant number of our population who don't have photo IDs, especially more senior members of our population whose births were recorded in a family Bible, like one of my clients in South Carolina. He had no physical proof of his birth other than his actual physical presence. And then he didn't even have the Bible anymore because it was burned in a family fire. And so to go with any documentation or to provide documentation to get the photo ID, he didn't have. And then that issue also, again, dealing with women. When you think about, okay, even if you have a photo ID, what if the name on the photo ID doesn't match the name you use today? A lot of women still decide when they get married to adopt their husband's name, but they don't take that extra step of changing their driver's license and their passport and their social security card, etc. So when they show up to vote, they look, the picture matches their physical appearance, but the last name doesn't match. And so you've got women who are eligible to vote, except the name on their photo ID doesn't match the name that they use today, and therefore they're being denied the ability to cast a regular ballot. They're being given provisional ballots, as I said oftentimes don't count. And so again, something as simple as a photo ID can have a dramatic, devastating impact on individuals, and that's just an example. I talked about polling places earlier, and this is an important issue because in Georgia, for example, there were several polling places that were closed. Many individuals never notified that their polling places were closed, and it shouldn't be a surprise that the majority of those closures happened in minority communities or low-income communities. Well, if you're a woman and your polling place has been closed and moved miles and miles away, you might not have the adequate transportation you need to get to this new polling place. You might not have a job that is flexible enough to give you the time you need for the travel and the line wait. Or you might have children and not be able to provide the child care coverage you need in order to exercise that right, because now you've got to account for an additional distance that you didn't have to contend with earlier just to cast a ballot. So again, something as innocuous seeming as the closure or the removing of a polling place can have a disparate impact. Another area in terms of how we can really help to advance the voting rights of all people, but especially women, is the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed with wide bipartisan support. The last measure was reauthorized in 2006. It got unanimous support in the House, almost unanimous support in the Senate, and was signed into law by President George W. Bush, a Republican president. Every single version of the Voting Rights Act prior to the one that's currently before Congress has enjoyed bipartisan support. This is the first time in the history of the Voting Rights Act that we don't have that the understood importance of the principle of the fundamental right to vote is now being used as a political wedge, and that the constituents are not being adequately represented, again, by those that they put in power. And I think it's especially notable because the 2006 reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act is named after three women, Fannie Lou Hamer, Rosa Parks, and Coretta Scott King, pioneers when it came to advancing the right to vote. This bill is in honor of them, of those women, and the many women who came before them, and the women who fought to get the passage of the 19th Amendment, and yet here it is being held up because of partisanship unnecessarily. Tomorrow, there is going to be some floor action. We're not sure what the outcome is going to be in the House, but for sure, I hope that we can all rally around the belief or the idea that voting should not be a partisan issue, that whatever political party with which you align, we at least can agree on that. So I just want to again thank you all for being here today. I want to thank you for the work that you do. I didn't get a chance to meet with everyone, but everyone with whom I did speak is doing amazing work. So I wish you continued luck and success. I can wish IWP continued growth in the Pensacola area and in the Panhandle in general. And I'm happy to answer any questions that folks might have before my time is up. No, well, yeah, I mean, I think that, so I've been focusing a lot on the Voting Rights Act and the passage, but it is my understanding that there's still a lot of movement in terms of passage of the ERA, and there might actually be some individuals who are part of that campaign. I definitely don't want to misspeak, but as far as I know, it's still being held up one more. And I know the League of Women Voters for sure has been doing a lot of work to get it advanced. Yes?
With the growing number of independents registered to vote, and the controversial outcomes of
We are in support of the popular vote. Now, there was a lot of movement immediately after the 2018 election, like there is honestly after a lot of major presidential elections, to move towards the popular vote. And my understanding is that there have been a number of states, I think about 193 votes now or so, in favor of moving towards or the ratification of the popular vote initiative. So we are in support of it. We do believe that that is the best illustration of every vote, one person, one vote. And that we're living in a different time. It's an example of, this debate of, do we stick to the original meaning and interpretation of the Constitution, or is it really a living, breathing document that has to evolve with our evolving society? We are in a society now where we can't have a popular vote count and adequately represent even the smallest states, with the smallest population. So the answer to your question is yes, we're in support of the popular vote. There is some very progressive movement on that front, but I think we'll probably be dealing with the Electoral College in November 2020. Yes.
You talked about the voting rights in 1965. Do you mind talking a little bit more about who that and what communities that voting right particularly impacts?
Sure. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was the culmination of a lot of efforts that we should all know about in terms of the civil rights movement, Bloody Sunday in Alabama and Selma, and all of the picketing that we saw. So the movement to advance a voting rights bill that would especially ensure protections for minority communities, particularly African American, Hispanic, Native American, and Asian American communities that historically not only have had difficulties voting, but actual institutional roadblocks imposed to make it impossible for them to vote. So there are a number of major provisions of the Voting Rights Act, but the two on which we rely heavily, number one was Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. That was a requirement that before a voting change could occur in a jurisdiction that had a history of discrimination in voting, they first had to get federal approval before they could initiate that change. And that requirement stopped things like closure of polling places or voter registration requirements that would have a disparate impact on particular populations. Unfortunately, in 2013, in a case known as Shelby County v. Holder, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down what's known as the coverage formula when it comes to Section 5. So what that means is that you had Section 5, but it only applied to certain jurisdictions. And in particular, there are 5 jurisdictions in Florida that were covered under Section 5. So the court held that that coverage formula was now outdated, that it was penalizing jurisdictions and in some cases whole states like Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana, because those were practices that had happened in the 50s and the 60s, and times have changed. People of color are being elected, and this idea that we're living in a post-racial society. So what we did, at that time I was with another organization, was put together a report to show that no, there are modern day examples of voter suppression alive and well, that are still having the same impact that make the Voting Rights Act and Section 5 in particular still necessary today. And in fact, following the Supreme Court's 2013 decision, Representative Marcia Fudge from Ohio initiated a committee that toured the country to hold hearings about what is the current landscape when it comes to voting rights. And she put together this report, which is on Congress's website for you to review, detailing instances where voter suppression, again, is still alive and well. I gave you some examples of photo ID, there's proof of citizenship, felon disfranchisement, again, the lack of early voting, the lack of no excuse absentee voting, and then the statistical analysis that shows that those kind of policies really harm and hinder certain communities from voting. So we call it the loss, really, of Section 5, which is why we're pushing for the enactment of what's known as the Voting Rights Advancement Act, H.R. 4. Another major provision of the Voting Rights Act upon which we rely is known as Section 2. And that provision prohibits the denial or dilution of voting rights to anyone simply based on race or color or national origin. And even though there have been a number of successful cases under Section 2, it's still litigation. It's very time-consuming, it's extremely expensive, you need a lot of experts, and because it's litigation, it simply takes years, oftentimes, for these cases to make their way up the appellate ladder. And so that's why Section 5 was so important, because you could stop bad practices in their tracks without having to incur all of that time and that expense. Other provisions of the Voting Rights Act, one known as Section 203, that covers protects individuals who are considered to be language minorities. So if you have a certain percentage in a particular jurisdiction where English is not the first language, especially when you talk about some Native American communities out west, then Section 203 requires the translation of all voting materials and ballots in that local language. So that's what the Voting Rights Act has been. It's been considered, I think, hands down, one of the most successful pieces of civil rights legislation ever passed. And we have seen since 2013 what its dismantling has caused. Yes.
First of all, thank you for the amazing things that you've done. My question is actually directed to you. What keeps you going? Because it's not easy. And I know there's a lot of us in the room that have been there, but what is it that just gives you that just makes you keep fighting, knocking them walls, and breaking that glass ceiling? Give it to us.
It's the past and the present, really. It is. I mean, for me, going back through the history of the 19th Amendment and seeing the struggles within women, the women's groups in terms of what do we want this language to even look like and how are we going to get there, and the strategies that they adopted. I mean, these were women who were living in, I took a flight from Atlanta today, it was 48 minutes. These are women who are taking trains and buggies across the country just to do this work. So I have to be inspired by them, and I definitely cannot give up if they did all of this work just so that I could literally be standing in front of you today. And then the present. I mean, I really want to underscore how impressed I am with you all, with this body as a politically diverse group coming together around this issue of increasing political participation of women. This, I wish, could be what our country and Congress represents, but it's not right now. But it gives me hope that because at the grassroots level, as just the people, that we're able to do this, that we'll be able to surpass what's happening today and really realize that better future.
I think that's a good place to end.
Thank you.
I just want to thank Nancy for such an erudite and genteel presentation of subject matter that could possibly be considered partisan, because she knows that we are a nonpartisan group. And I want to thank all the people that disagreed with her for their civil ability to sit in the room and think about this. It's food for thought. And especially non-members, we are balanced. We have a variety of speakers, trust me. I felt someone squirming behind me. I also wanted to just take a second, and I forgot to mention that we have a subject matter expert in our midst too, Amy Parker. I forgot to mention, you're our newest member. I mentioned the newest male member, but not the newest female member, so thank you for being here. I also want to recognize some volunteers that helped out today tremendously. Where's Camille? Camille Bonner, thank you. Nancy Hagman. Lisa Evers, thanks for coming early and doing all this work, setting this up. I think it turned out great. I'd also like to make sure I recognize the board. If y'all could stand up. Hannah Ritz, Nancy Prevo, Vicki Garrett, Deb Corbin, Anna Higgins. We are a diverse board in many ways, and believe me, we are able to hold civil conversation about politics. That's what we're all about. So all of you board members, go find a non-member and talk to them, and let's get some new members here today.